requested appropriately that at each of our future council meetings, including this one, we provide a short update on what's happening with the COVID-19 response and its implications for the city. Given that it's generally not going to be possible to have a staff report before each meeting, but I'll just be providing verbal updates and also sending you emails when I can ahead of time. So I did send a copy of a budget memo that was written by our finance director and deputy finance director. Hopefully you all have it, have a chance to bring it up in front of you. Before I go into that, let me just very quickly answer some of the questions that were asked in their items from the audience. First, on parking enforcement, we are still doing enforcement for public safety. So we are not writing tickets for anyone who's spending too much time, so we're not enforcing time and we're not asking people to pay for parking. However, we are enforcing things like parking illegally in handicap zones, or parking in front of fire hydrants, or parking ways that block access to driveways and so forth. So we are still out there, but only ticketing if it's related to public safety or access from folks who have handicap permits. Second thing, we will be doing a response to this on our Kirkland, the question about closing down Lake Washington Boulevard to make traffic go better for people who are walking and trying to be socially distant. After a detailed discussion by the directors and in consultation with the council, our conclusion was not to do that. The primary reason being it will be very, very difficult to keep Lake Washington Boulevard closed to traffic. We also think it may end up resulting in inviting people from the region since it's such a spectacular view, and it also may end up having more people come rather than fewer and may have some unintended consequences. Finally, given the fact that everyone in the community is now ordering many things online, food, important necessities, having the major thoroughfare closed is going to be a real challenge. And so for all of those reasons, even though we do understand the potential safety benefit for social distancing, the conclusion was it's not the right decision for the city at this time. Any questions on that before I go on?
Councilmember Nixon.
Yeah, I thought that the proposal in the comment email wasn't about closing the road as much as it was about making the sidewalks one way, northbound maybe on the east side and southbound maybe on the west side. Has that been considered?
We have not talked about that. We could certainly talk about that as staff. Always what happens is the enforcement is the challenge, right? But we'll talk about that.
Of course. Okay.
And then the gates.
And there was also the question about, in that same email, about the gates. Are you going to address that as well?
That was my next issue. So the gates issue is another one that's a little bit challenging. The conclusion of the staff was that we were going to let the gates remain closed, even though the gates should not have been closed by the private property owners. They are public access. They do not have the right to close them, and the city is going to be closing the remainder as well. And we'll be talking with the property owners about that and the fact that they shouldn't be closing the gates, and that can be enforced against them in the future. The reason we have concluded to shut the gates is that the walkways there are very narrow, and just like the previous discussion, the ability to keep social distancing of 6 feet or more passing on those narrow walkways is very challenging, and they're also right next to the yards and patios of the actual property owners, and so we just felt that the issue of social distancing, both for the homeowners and for passersby, is really challenging in those two areas. And so we're going to have all the smaller walkways closed in the short term while we have the pandemic emergency. But again, that's a decision that the city needs to make and not one that the owners can make. All right, anything else on those before I go to the memo? So I won't talk too long about the memo, and I'm happy to answer questions. I think the key point of the COVID-19 update today is that we're starting to see a shift. So the first month of March, since our very first declaring an emergency on February 29th, has really been dealing with the outbreak itself, and particularly the Life Care Center and its impact on our police and fire. And that has really taken everything the city has to get through that, and we more or less have at this point. So things are stabilizing on that front. One of the things council members had requested is an update from police and fire on what are we seeing in terms of calls. And so we don't have anything in writing to give you yet, but in talking with both chiefs, right now we are not seeing a measurable uptick in calls, particularly on the fire side. The calls have actually been pretty consistent with the past March. We are seeing a small uptick at the moment in respiratory related calls that could end up being COVID calls, but if you take out the Life Care Center calls, it's still a relatively regular month of March. We're obviously going to be tracking that very carefully as the COVID issue peaks. On the police side, we have seen anecdotally upticks in some of the mental health and behavioral health issues, such as domestic violence, as was read by Councilmember Pascal earlier today. Not, again, yet something that is statistically measurable significantly. We're seeing a little bit of burglaries also on the uptick, particularly closed businesses and storage units. So the numbers are small, but the crime rates in Kirkland are fairly small, so any change has a fairly measurable impact. So we do hope by the next council meeting to actually have something that will be in the council dashboard reports. So I want to see if any questions on that before I go to the financial. Okay, so as I said, the purpose of tonight is to say as we're beginning to shift away from the immediate response to COVID itself, although that's clearly a huge issue for us still, we're now beginning to look at the long-term implications of what's happening to the financial environment and its implications for our budget, and appropriate to some of the comments that were under items from the audience. So what we have given you, and this will be posted after the council meeting publicly, is a sort of a very quick update of our initial forecast. And I do have Michael Olson, Finance Director, on the phone again, who can answer additional questions if you have them. Our number one issue that we're tracking carefully is the impact to sales tax. And what you can see from the chart on page 2, how we broke this out is revenue we think we're going to lose, revenue we think that's just going to be deferred by actions the council is going to be taking, and then other implications. So what we're showing is at our current rates, which is, again, these are all projections, is we could have as much as a $6 million loss of sales tax for the whole of 2020, based on our best forecasting at this moment. What you see in the memo is the net loss would be about $4 million. And part of the reason for that is, as you know, we have a very conservative 2-year sales tax lag policy. And so we have about $2 million of 2019 sales tax that came in higher than projection. And so that offsets some of the $6 million. So right now, conservatively, we're looking at about a $4 million loss of sales tax and other related revenues for going into the 2021 budget cycle. All along with that are some issues such as the lost revenue from not enforcing tickets for time limits and not charging for parking. We also are not going to be having revenue that will support the public safety initiatives related to the schools from the school safety cameras, because those cameras were turned off when school was closed. So we're going to need to make sure we're paying for the police and court positions that are related to those, and that will be lost revenue. We are trying to evaluate everything else. Our staff have been calling through the hotels, and we're finding that the rates of occupancy are in the 2% to 5% rate of occupancy. So we're obviously seeing a significant drop in both economic activity, but also that will have a direct implication for the hotel motel tax and then for the tourism development monies as well. So that's sort of the highlight from the current financial forecast. When we started the budget process in February, we're obviously looking at a little bit of a challenge already with the annexation sales tax credit. So I think the message to the council and the public is it's going to be a much different budget than even we thought in February. The very good news, and this is also included in your memo, is the city has been budgeting conservatively for decades, and particularly in the last decade since the 2008-2009 Great Recession. We have been very religiously putting money aside, about 1% of our budget a year. And so all of our budget reserves are pretty much back to full. And so if you look at, gotta make sure I have my hard copies in the right order here. If you look at page 5 on the memo, we gave a list to the council of all of our current general fund reserves. And so just for those who are listening, we have about $5.6 million in our contingency reserve fund, which can be used for any sort of purpose. We have an operating reserve, a rainy day fund of about $4.8 million, and we have a revenue stabilization reserve of a little over $3 million. And that's to deal with fluctuations like we're seeing. So the combination of all those is about $13.5 million in reserves that can be used to get us through this crisis. Obviously, in the budget discussions, we'll be looking at actions we need to take immediately to address the loss of revenue, but we'll also be looking at these reserves for what they're for, which is to give us time to make thoughtful decisions and decisions that set us up well for the future. So last two things I'll say, and then I'll open up for questions. We also included, just as sort of helpful background, some other information. One is our current projected cost directly associated with the COVID response is now projected to be about $600,000. Of that, we think about half of that, or a little bit more, will be reimbursed by the various federal programs, particularly FEMA and the stimulus package. And then we anticipate covering the rest with the GEMT funds, which the council kept unallocated when they first came in. So these are funds that are paid to us for for fire response and transport of folks on Medicare. So it's a very appropriate use of those funds. They can be used for anything, but to use them to help repay back what we've been doing on COVID is, we think, a very good use of them. So I'll just stop there. I know that's a lot of information, and as I said, this memo will be posted, so those folks who are listening or watching this after the fact will make sure that they get a chance to see it. But any questions or comments?
Councilmember Pascal.
Thanks to staff and everyone for preparing this information. I mean, I think it'll be great to be able to share it with the community, because I know I've had questions from folks about impacts to budget and services. I guess for me, I'm kind of curious about if you could kind of summarize the timeline going forward in terms of what we should be expecting. So it seems like we're going to need to make continual decisions between now and the end of the year regarding budgetary items. So what does that look like? I mean, so obviously we need a plan for the next 2-year budget, but for the remainder of the year, we're probably going to have to make some decisions. And so what do you see as a timeline for that?
Yeah, thank you.
Potentially.
So we're still aiming for most of the major policy decisions for the May council retreat. That would be normally our launch for the budget process, with full projections from what happened in 2019, all the monies we had and under expenditures, and sort of the forecast going forward. So in a standard year, that's really the formal kickoff for the council, the budget process, even though we do a lot of work behind the scenes as staff. So we're going to be still doing that. It's going to be a much different presentation, because it will then have a lot more information about what else. We'll know more about the lost revenue. As I think council members know, there's about a 2-month lag on sales tax information. So we won't really see the March and April impacts until June. And that's when we'll really get a sense of what's happening with the sales tax. We'll also know probably by the end of May what's going on with the governor's order and whether we're still in stay home, stay healthy, or whether there's some other change. So we're projecting a variety of different things. The May retreat is where we're going to really start laying out some of the tough choices that will come as a result of this. So we'll be looking at actions such as, are we holding all vacancies? Are we, what are decisions we're starting to make about temporary employees? The main places we know these have implications for using the 2009 experience is parks and streets, public works, because we really try to prioritize keeping public safety funded, and that's really our fundamental duty is police and fire, public safety. So we'll start looking at that. We'll be looking at creative ways to get us from here to there. But so really May is where most of this will kick off, and then we do have a budget calendar, which I'll have reset out to you, and we'll still follow that calendar. It's just that the choices are going to be a lot harder, and we'll be teeing up things earlier for you a little bit than we have in the past. So,
yeah, thank you. It's helpful. It's helpful for me, and I'm sure others, to kind of explain to the public kind of what that timeline might look like, and when decisions might need to be made into the future. And we know that's going to be tough. So, thank you.
Thank you. And then, like this presentation, we'll be just, as soon as we know issues, we'll bringing them to the council and these updates in other places. So we'll keep providing information if we don't have it for the formal retreat yet. One last thing I'd say about the budget memo that we gave you is oftentimes we get asked, well, what happens if sales tax goes up or down 1%, or what happens if property tax goes up or down 1%? And so there is a chart in there that shows sort of the implications of a 1% increase in each of those funds or decrease. So you can do the math either way. We also have included in there what happens if wages went up 1% or went down 1%, since they're the bulk of our city expenditures or salaries and wages. So that's just sort of helpful background for you, so you can see if you have significant increases or decreases in things, what it actually means in terms of the overall budget. We did include development services reserves and utility reserves as well. Those will also be something we watch very closely. They're not as impacted by the general fund changes that are happening, but obviously development activity has been paused, and where the council has also made the decision to defer payment of utilities if people can't pay. So we'll probably have more to say on those coming up, but those do have healthy reserves as well and are less impacted by this, but they will be impacted. All right, so that's my current COVID-19 update. Again, we'll have one every 2 weeks, and I do want to thank again the council for its leadership on these issues, and the staff who've done a phenomenal job. We still have our Emergency Operations Center open. It'll be open for the next 2 weeks for sure, and then we'll always revisit whether it needs to continue to be open. So, and we'll be providing the public and the council with updates on that every day as well still.
Great. Thanks, Kurt. That was a great report. We're on top of this like nobody else is. So that takes us to our consent calendar. Before we have a motion, I'd like to ask Deputy Mayor Arnold to present the audit of accounts.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. We had bills in the amount of $6,640,832.18 and payroll in the amount of $4,240,430.96.
Thank you. Can I get a motion to approve the consent calendar?